to another Friday Solidarity episode. Today, Kyle and I are joined by our advisory board member, Kwasi. I'm sorry, man, I might butcher your last name. Adusei, or how do you say it?
Adusei.
Okay, thank you. And you are a nurse practitioner. You've got a lot of experience organizing in psychedelic spaces. And just glad to have you on the show again. I think we've done an episode before, right?
Yeah. I appreciate you for inviting me.
Yeah, so today we're recording on June 3, and we're seeing a really weird cultural situation going on where, this has been happening for, centuries. So maybe it's not that weird. It's just finally we're getting enough attention on it. But, white violence on Black folks. And it's just really crazy, this kind of response the government's chosen to take, which is like arresting more people and doing more violence to more people when people are trying to rise up to like protest this kind of extrajudicial killing that's been going on for so long. And I don't know, Kyle and I being, white guys from the suburbs, like it's hard for us to really relate and understand much about it. You grew up in the Bronx, so you probably, saw some things, dealt with some stuff. But
yeah,
I'm wondering, like, how do you like to approach this topic, or where do you even like to start? Or I know it's probably horrible to talk about, but we need to.
Yeah, I agree. And it's difficult. It's difficult for a lot of reasons and difficult for a lot of groups of people for different reasons. For Black and brown populations, the stuff that's going on, we're sort of used to it. We sort of expect it, unfortunately. I think it's really wonderful to see so many people rising up to fight against a lot of the injustice. I can't remember the last time that we saw protests in every single state, and not just every single state, but all over the world about this incident. So people are fed up. They're tired of it. They're sick of it happening. They're sick of seeing it on the news cycles. And the solutions to it are so variable. There's so many different things to kind of target because there's so many different problems that are involved with everything that's going on. And so, what we're seeing right now with George is really a culmination of things that have been happening, as you said, for centuries. And we're seeing a different aspect of it right now. And, recently the fight's been against police violence. And thankfully, and unfortunately, these incidences are being recorded, because were they not being recorded, we wouldn't see this outrage, because these things were happening. They've been happening for a long time. And it really just kind of speaks to a lot of history in America and a lot of the systemic racism that we're seeing. And so for me, having grown up in the Bronx, the environment that I grew up in was tough. It wasn't uncommon to hear about gang-related deaths, gun violence. And for me, I went to a middle school that's been closed since. Right now, it was closed because of how poor the graduation rates were. And so I'm somebody who has a doctorate now. I went through 10 years of higher education. I was in sixth grade. I almost failed out of school.
Oh, wow.
I almost didn't make it out of middle school. And so that wasn't a product of my lack of intelligence, but rather a product of the environment that wasn't very conducive to success. And so it's a lot of those reasons that you'll see in different avenues, just environments not conducive to success that leads to these situations that we're seeing with George Floyd, that leads to a lot of the anger that we're seeing right now, because the anger isn't just about George and what's going on with him. It's about everything that's been happening. And the world is seeing it. People in Australia are seeing it. People in London, right, all across Europe are protesting against what's happening here in America. And so, I think it's a really powerful thing. And I'm happy to see that it's getting as much attention as it is.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to watch people step up and stand up, especially across the world, and seeing people protest within all 50 states. I guess, something I was wondering, I wonder why this impacted the nation and the world a little bit harder than some of the other stuff that's been going on and other acts of violence that have been going on.
So, I mean, I see it as a two-part thing
Hmm.
here. The first part is that you have the snowball effect. So each of these incidences that happen over time, the anger around it grows. As we roll down the hill, the anger grows. And so every time it happens, there's more and more outrage. People are asking themselves, again,
Yeah.
is this seriously still happening? Right? And so it's easy to get frustrated. And people should get frustrated because these are lives that are being lost. For what? Because people aren't trained well enough. That's part of the reason. Also, because people have these biases that they're approaching people of color with when they're in positions of power. That's another part of it. A uniform really does something for people. Everybody knows about the obedience study, right? Where when you know that my actions can be placed on a superior, you'll do harmful things to people. And these are the things that explain what happened in Nazi Germany, right, with Mussolini. These are the things that we're seeing right now, is that we have a police force that stems out of essentially slavery, right? So around the Civil War, the police were being used to protect white property. They were being used to capture slaves. They were militant. And so this what we're seeing are remnants of that.
Mm.
And so we're just frustrated with seeing how those dynamics are then leading to lives being lost. So that's part of it. The other thing I think has a lot to do with the coronavirus,
Yeah.
right? So tensions are high. Tensions have been high for months now. People have been cooped up. People have been losing their jobs. People are having trouble feeding their children. People are losing friends and family members, and they're grieving, and they're not able to come together to spaces that support them. They can't go to church. They can't even go to the funeral. So we're losing
Yeah.
these outlets that we have to grieve, and we're suffering. And so you go through that for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then something like this happens. So it's all of this pent up anxiety, all of this pent up anger, all of it just came out. And so this is an opportunity now that folks have an outlet. Folks have a way to share their anger, not just with this incident, but with the world and the state of the world.
Mhm.
So I think those two in combination are sort of this perfect storm, right? Like these ingredients to allowing this much exposure, this much anger, this many people who are coming out, who perhaps if the coronavirus wasn't happening, people wouldn't have the opportunity to come out and do this. They wouldn't have that pent up energy and anxiety and anger to come out. And so the combination of those two happening is, I think, what's causing this to become such a widespread, sort of phenomenon.
Yeah, it's I'm glad people finally had we hit this kind of tipping point, right, where we haven't really had this kind of stuff since Rodney King, at this kind of level. But this is now worldwide. It's not just Los Angeles, and I'm really kind of happy to see it. But it also there's a shadow side, there's a light side here. Some people who we're theoretically protesting for are, there's no longer a bus stop, so they can't really even get to work anymore easily. It takes way longer. So, and some people just can't even go outside because there's just violence outside their homes. But in other places, it's nice, relatively peaceful protest until the curfew comes, where the police say, oh, no, free speech has time limits and space limits. So time to go home. And it's, I don't know. Do you have any kind of response to those kind of things? I don't want to bite off more than we can chew and kind of single things here.
Yeah. So, I think it's important to look to the family of George Floyd. What are they saying? And what they're saying is they're really, really angry with the violence that's coming out of these protests, right? the point of a protest is to make a statement that expresses some disapproval of what's going on. And so it very well may be that the way that some people are showing that disapproval is through damaging things, right? Through harmful means, because the anger that a lot of people are showing as people are damaging property and so on and so forth is the same anger that people should have when lives are being lost. But in the same right,
Yeah.
It's totally taking away from the movement. And more often than not, I would imagine that the protests that are leading to a lot of the harms, the violence, these are opportunists, right? These are people who are not there because they believe in the movement. They're not there because they want to fight against police brutality, but because they want to capitalize on chaos. And so it totally changes the conversation for the people who are on the other side of this. And so for the other side, they look at this and they're saying, see, these people are uncivilized, right? Why are they doing this? Where's the law and order? And it completely takes away from the messaging, because right now, rather than solely focusing on the messaging of changing the systematic issues that lead to incidents like what we see with George Floyd happening, we're instead talking about people who are graffitiing and causing violence, inciting hate in other ways. In Buffalo, we've had some riots where, somebody tried to set City Hall on fire. We had an incident where a young woman was shot, and it's unclear where the bullets came from, whether it was from the state police or it's from rioters themselves. We have cars that are driving through police barricades aimlessly. And so all of this chaos that's happening right now is totally detracting from the real messaging here. Because, protesting is an important right. And this is in many ways validating this strong arming against the protesting. And so we have somebody in office right now who is pushing the governors towards brute force, law and order, containment. I read an article the other day, I think everybody's heard about this at this point, where he had the military clear out peaceful protesters so that he could take a picture in front of a church.
It was pretty sickening, like hearing him give his speech. You could just hear like explosions go off, maybe like the tear gas bombs or whatever, or them firing rubber bullets. And, he's giving this speech and you just hear these explosions in the background. And you're just like, what the fuck?
It's terrible.
It's sickening.
The leadership that we have is really important, right? Like the way that leadership approaches conflict, that's a huge role of leadership, is how do you approach crisis? How do you both calm the nerves of people while getting to the root of the matter, right? How do you show strong leadership? And time again, we have a president who's shown really irresponsible leadership. And this is just another one of those things where, unfortunately, we have a lot of people who support everything that this man does. The unfortunate part is that he doesn't care about the United States. He cares about his base. And so his base is looking at a lot of this, and they're in support of what the police are doing to run protesters off of the street, using the violence and some of the harmful effects that the protesting, or rather the rioting, has caused as justification to run people off the streets. I think for people who are living in these communities, it's a shame that their homes are being ravaged, that their businesses are being ravaged. Nobody deserves to have that happen to them. Nobody deserves to have their life savings or their life's work completely rampaged by rioters. Um, that absolutely shouldn't be happening. And unfortunately, it is. And so those people who are doing that, I mean, I think they're doing a really, really great disservice to the movement, and they're really, really taking away from what the messaging should be. And our president isn't really being helpful in the situation either.
Yeah, almost like instigating it a little bit here and there.
Oh, absolutely is.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's been some subtexts in his statement that are actually like inciting counter protesters and kind of insurgents. And we've caught a lot of those people on camera. Said, "Oh, you're actually a cop breaking windows so that we can now come arrest everybody."
That's just disgusting.
Yeah, and that's the confusing part about all this.
And it's happening a lot, right?
Right? It's like, who's actually instigating all this stuff? Is it the protesters that are actually out there, or is it, some sort of other group of people that are trying to, as you said, kind of capitalize off that fear and be able to start this kind of like that herd mentality, right? If somebody goes and does something, might give them permission to maybe act that anger out. At times. And I think that's some of the confusing part is like you have people out there that are, I see so many peaceful protesters out there doing stuff, trying to really defend why they are out there. And then, you just have a couple bad actors, just like bad police officers, maybe stirring the pot up. I watched a video of somebody in New York, a black woman, just like yelling at a group of like white protesters. And I think maybe she caught them destroying like a bus stop, but just saying like, this homeless person uses his bus stop, to shelter. He also uses it to charge his phone. He's like, you guys get to go home back to your suburbs and cushy housing while you're actually destroying where we live. And this isn't what this is about. And that was a really powerful video to watch. Just like thinking about the impact that this is really having on already impoverished communities.
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, I'm hoping that what comes of this is just a different way to look at solutions, a different way to look at how we can all sort of contribute to this, considering what our spheres of influence is, right? Like we each have a sphere of influence, whether if it's in our household or if it's our community or we have an audience. I think we should all be asking ourselves, okay, if I care about the messaging, how can I use my sphere of influence to change things? So part of the problem is 100%, it's the police brutality, right? But it's also the education systems. It's also, the way that money is being dispersed in communities. How much are we using to fund police versus how much are we using to fund community services, right? How much are we using to fund public health in schools? And so, yeah, I mean, people are suffering. People are having their lives pretty much torn up by some of the decisions that are being made. And, as terrible as everything is, I'm really hopeful that we can start to really ask ourselves, if I'm somebody who is active and cares a lot about what the movement is trying to spread, what can I do to contribute to that?
Mm-hmm. So for folks like Kyle and I, we have this platform. So we plan to help give platforms to folks who can give feedback and report back stories and ideas on how, folks like Kyle and I and our listeners can have an impact. Do you have any kind of people you feel are leading the way forward positively? Like I really like Van Jones, but I don't really know too much about him other than I've liked his activism in the past. Like, do you like anybody or point people towards anybody in particular or any groups?
Well, I think that looking at who we can support locally is really important, right? So we can look to some of these national figures, some of these well-known people who are speaking out against a lot of these things. But I think what's really important is figuring out who are the politicians that are supporting the things that are aligned with you, right? Like who can I go and vote for, right? What community organizations can I pour my money towards to support that's going to help the communities that really need it. I think we often get very distracted by looking at these global issues and don't often enough look right in our surroundings, right? When we're talking about a sphere of influence here, you can even look at, right, like the presidential elections, where people vote for the presidential elections. But when it comes to local elections, mayoral elections, right, city council elections, a lot of people don't really have very much information about, what they're able to do, who they're able to support, who they should support, And so I think my answer to that question is find out who your local leaders are, right? Find out who the local community organizers and the organizations that are doing stuff for your community. Find out who they are, because one of the ways that you can do more than just say that I'm an ally, to do more than just say that I support these things, that I'm not racist, so on and so forth, is to, turn it into an act, right?
Mm.
Looking at it as something that's more of a verb than an adjective, right?
Mm.
I think that, when you look at the word ally, it's something that should be more than a descriptor, but rather an action. And so, yeah, just finding out who your local leaders are is going to be probably the most powerful thing that you can do, right? So being informed for yourself and then sharing that information with people. And so I right now especially is a really good opportunity to do that, because because of this incident, people are thinking about, where are my tax dollars being spent? How are they being spent? There was just a petition that was pretty much sent out because our local police department was asking for an increase. And so the petition is asking that our police force here doesn't get that increase that they're asking, and rather that money goes towards, places that really need it, right?
Hmm.
That it's going to schools. I learned recently we spend probably $60,000. Our tax dollars pays for about $60,000 for the prison population per person a year, and pays under $2,000 per student a year, right? So the way that our money is being dispersed, the way that the proportions are being sent out there, we have a voice in that. We have something that we can use, which is our vote, to change that. And so, really asking yourself those questions and figuring out what are the acts that I can do, and I think it's also important to just, of course, educate yourself about systemic racism, educate yourself about what's going on now, the history behind it, also acknowledging your own privilege, because we all have different levels of privilege. And even me, as a Black man, I have a huge privilege, right? I'm college higher ed educated. I had the privilege afforded to me to be able to go to school for as long as I went to get the degree that I got, which gives me a voice. And I was able to
Hmm.
sort of get to the place that I'm at now. And so now the question that I'm asking myself is, how can I use my position and my degree and my education to help other people who don't have such great access? And so the questions that I'm asking right now are really about mental health and communities
Mm.
of color, right? What are the stigmas that are holding people back from seeking mental health treatment? And how do we remove those barriers, right?
Hmm.
What are the access issues that are preventing people from getting to treatment? And how can I use my position to sort of support that? And so in my sphere of influence here, I'm putting information together for the counselors that we have in my organization to educate them more about, the things that they can do, the way that they can interact with their clients of color.
Hmm.
We have very few counselors of color in this organization, and the organization has about 700 employees, so it's large, right? But there aren't a lot of people who are coming out of these communities and going into these roles like mental health, when there's such large stigmas around mental health in those communities. The way that we look at mental health is different, because in communities of color, people lean more on spirituality,
Hmm.
right? They lean more on the church as their source of mental health treatment. But what we really need to understand is that there's a collective here. There's a holistic view that we need to have, that wellness is spirituality, but it's also mental health and physical health. And so for my sphere of influence, it's really promoting that message. And so just having that question asked, right? Asking yourself, what's my sphere of influence, and what are the things that I can do to essentially create a better world, And I think that it's great that you guys are having this conversation on a psychedelic podcast. I think it's really important because many of the people who are listening to this podcast are very privileged people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's allowing these messages to reach them, And it's the reason why I felt really compelled to speak with you guys today, is because we too often see our different movements as silos, and we don't think often enough about how interconnected they are.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think often enough that the psychedelic movement needs to be considered, or is something that needs to be connected with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because when what we're talking about here are drug policies, and it's the drug policies that are so disproportionately affecting people of color, right? So we have to look more about all of how these pieces sort of connect, how these ingredients come together to essentially create a better world. So yeah, I really appreciate that you guys are having this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Joe and I were chatting about that the other day, just kind of trying to debrief all this stuff and try to make sense of it. And we were even saying, like, what we're doing here is kind of like a social justice project here, because so much of psychedelics is wrapped up in oppression, right? We're thinking about like sacred plant medicines and the people that have been oppressed there. And as you pointed out, like drug policy. And, I know Joe always refers to the Carl Hart presentation that was at Horizons, talking about like that psychedelic exceptionalism and thinking that these drugs are much different than other drugs that are people using. And we have to kind of really challenge that narrative. And yeah, just thinking about access, right? This is something I've been thinking about. And I'm so glad that you even touched on like the mental health aspect within these communities. Just thinking about access to psychedelic medicines, and are people of color going to have access to this type of treatment? And just even thinking back to like some of my social justice courses in my counseling program, just talking about how like self-development is so individualized, and how can we go beyond the therapy room, right? It's like whenever I think about psychedelics or the self-development thing, it's like, oh, how can I better myself, right? And how do I work on myself? But like, that's fine and dandy, but then what happens when you go back out into a system where there's like systemic oppression and all these issues that are just continuing to perpetuate the root causes of it? So yeah, I think this stuff is all interconnected, and I've definitely brought up on the show before, even just the idea of like cannabis, like for how many years the disproportionate amount of people getting arrested, people of color, for cannabis use. And now as this is starting to become legalized, you're starting to see rich, privileged people make a shit ton of money off of it, while there's still people of color and marginalized communities still impacted by that and in prison still for this stuff. And so I think we really have to sit down and examine this and ask these really hard questions. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Kwasi.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really want to emphasize that, for the people who are listening to this podcast, who are out there that have acknowledged their privilege, looking at the world in sort of a different way, that, yes, that the psychedelic movement is connected to the drug policy movement, which is connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, but not just leaving yourself in that silo of, because I'm working and actively within the psychedelic movement, then I am inherently working towards the Black Lives Matter movement, but rather I'm working in the psychedelic movement and I can put my support towards this Black Lives Matter movement because they are connected, right? So that's going back to, learning about what your community organizations are, because you are a psychedelic advocate, right? And because all of these issues are extremely important, and because right now the need is for those communities of color to get all of the support that they can. And so a lot of the people who are using psychedelics tend to be privileged people, right? And so this audience is an audience that needs to be considering a lot of these questions. How can I, as a psychedelic supporter, actively support these communities of color if I care about this, if I'm saying that I'm an ally? And I really, really want to hammer that message home. That all of this that we're doing, it's for nothing if we're not supporting each other, right? If we're not really bringing those people who need help, if we're not raising them up when we can, if we're not doing what we can to allow our privilege to support those who are um, disenfranchised. And, it brings up the whole COVID issue too,
Mm.
because what we're seeing is that, Black and brown people are dying at higher rates to COVID
Mm-hmm.
because of, all of the injustices that are allowing them to have these sort of ailments that predispose them to the coronavirus, right? So it's this issue that just keeps showing up in so many different ways. So if you are somebody who's a supporter of psychedelic medicine, right, don't only ask yourself, how can I support psychedelic medicine, but also ask yourself, how can I support my brothers and sisters around me?
Yeah, thank you for that. What you just said about COVID just brought up something, idea of privilege and spirituality. Might be a little off topic, but might also be worth highlighting here. As we're starting to watch a lot of this unfold, and I think some people in the psychedelic world, and especially the spirituality world as well, they're seeing a lot of this chaos as somewhat of a good thing at times, right? They're like, oh, it's cleansing things out, and maybe we're going through some sort of spiritual emergence process, and we're raising our vibration, and we got to work with the shadow. And I brought this idea to a teacher of mine as COVID was really happening, and this idea of holding this bigger picture, right? Because sometimes in psychedelic states, you see this bigger thing of, maybe you see destruction as a possible good thing at times, right? You see this natural order of death and rebirth, and you can kind of get this idea, this meta view of, oh, everything is kind of working out the way it's supposed to be working. And then on the other side, like holding that, there's a lot of shit going on in the world right now. A lot of people are suffering. A lot of people have been suffering. So I was asking him, like, as a Native American elder, how do you hold these worldviews? Like, you're teaching spirituality, and I kind of want to know what you're thinking about it. And obviously he threw it back on me to figure out how I was making sense of it. But something that he said was like, sometimes that spiritual viewpoint is a very privileged place to be. Viewing it from the outside perspective, he's like, I know plenty of elders that are on reservations that do not view COVID as a spiritual thing, right? Because they're already living in poverty, they're not in the best health, and there are going to be higher rates of, possible deaths and infection there. And are they seeing this as a spiritual event unfolding? And so I think even just within, the spiritual and psychedelic community that might have, I don't know, more susceptibility of thinking about things from a bigger meta perspective of kind of even viewing that and taking time to sit with it as well and think about like how that's could be even a privileged perspective of you're not dealing with the stuff. So you have all this time to think about how this isn't affecting you and how you're watching the shadow unfold and you're not being affected by it. So yeah, I don't know, something I just wanted to toss out there.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that because it's so true. I've seen some articles and have spoken to some friends who are happy about what's happening with Corona because in their minds, this is a good thing because the air is cleaner, right? Because the earth is able to breathe. And 100%, those are true facts. The air is cleaner. The earth is able to breathe better. But as you said, she's only able to say that because they're not being directly affected by what's going on. So totally it's coming from a very privileged perspective and, sort of to the point of the spiritual point, of looking at everything from a spiritual lens, right? I think that the idea is that all things are happening as they should be, right? And that nature, life, things tend to balance themselves out. And there's no such thing as good or bad, only your perspective and whether it's good or bad for you, which kind of speaks to this point here. I think even about this seesaw effect that we have, right? Where, we had 8 years of Obama and because of that, in part because of that, it mobilized a lot of very racist people who felt that they were being threatened, their whiteness was being threatened. And we followed Obama with a Donald Trump, right? And so we're having this back and forth of good and bad, light and dark. it's interesting, but and it does feel like this is sort of the natural order of the world, and these difficult situations are always going to keep on happening, right? And change is the only constant that we have in life.
Hmm.
And so, like, acknowledging that firstly is important, but then saying, okay, when these negative situations do come about, how can we, what role can I play to help it
Hmm.
swing back in the other direction? How can
Yes.
we sort of look at all the things that are happening and be a part of the reason why it's switching over to the other direction? And so, just acknowledging the sort of yin yang nature of life and reality isn't enough. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is then asking yourself those questions, right? What can I do to help it swing back in a positive direction?
Totally. And I love that, just this idea of like, because I've definitely had those visions and experiences in holotropic states where I'm seeing all the destruction, but also seeing the beauty of the rebirth as well. But I just like this idea of like the passive type of spirituality where it's like, oh, I don't need to do anything because everything's just in flux and I don't need to do anything, versus this more active role in saying these things are happening, but what's my role here? And how can I act on it to maybe bring it back in balance or be part of it instead of being removed from it and just kind of watching it pass by. So I really like that.
Sure. The important point here is that, when you really look at it, nobody has to do anything, right? Nobody has to do something that's going to swing it back in the other direction. But if you say that you care about these things, then you have to, right? Because that's how you can be aligned with the words that you're preaching, right? That's how you can be aligned with the things that you're saying. So it's important that, like, because there social media is interesting, right? So right now there's so much happening on social media of people who are coming out and, voicing their support of what's going on, voicing their support of, a change in policies and a change in the way that, Black people and people of color are treated, right? And so that voicing of support, if you're going to voice the support, needs to be followed up with different things, right? Whether it's like figuring out who your local representatives are, or making donations towards the people who are actually working towards changing some of these injustices that are happening. So I they're all really important questions. There are a lot of really important conversations, and it starts with having the conversations in the first place. So
Hmm.
I'm grateful to see how many people are coming out and voicing their support, and so I'm hoping that it is followed up by action.
Yeah, and this is early days, right? So, eh, like, I don't think this is going to calm down, next week, right? Like, this is probably going to be a long project. It's already been a long project. And how do we, it's tough because we want to see the change immediately, just like with psychedelics. But really, this is a long thing. It takes growth and healing, a lot like life. But we should still stay on it as much as we can and not lose sight of what are we doing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the snake sheds its skin at the rate that it's supposed to shed, right?
Mm.
And so, it's important to keep the end goal in mind, but really it's the process that's important here,
Hmm.
And so just figuring out what that process is for you, and that process is going to be different for everybody. But figuring out what that process is for you is important because, I'm asking myself a lot of these questions now and I'm seeing where my role is here.
Hmm.
And we all have a piece, we all have a role, we all have something that we can add to it. So just figuring out exactly what your role is going to be the key here.
That's important. And I also wonder too about the role and how important it is to actually maybe ask or listen to some of these communities. Because also think about like, oh, okay, I figured out my role, so I know what to go do now, right? And so this brings up this topic that I heard from a friend of mine who is a social worker that was doing some work in Central America, helping to rebuild villages. And when she quit, I asked her like, why did she step away from that? And she said, sometimes the organization's agenda was not in alignment with what the community actually wanted. It was like we wanted to go down there and rebuild these villages, and half the time those folks didn't want what we had to offer. right? And so I think it's also important to maybe take a step back and maybe listen as well, without immediately taking action.
I totally 100% agree, right? The first step in anything that you do, the first step should always be assessment. And
Mhm.
part of that assessment is trying to figure out what the needs are. Instead of coming in and being sort of a savior, right? It sort of reminds me of something that happened with the Psychedelic Society of Western New York,
Mm.
where one of the things that we did is we started a community garden in a community that was a primarily immigrant community. And so we kind of came in and we had about 10 beds that we grew a bunch of food, tomatoes and corn and peppers. And, we wanted to do it for the community. And so they had full access so they can come and grab wherever they wanted to grab. But we never asked them, are
Mm.
you using these things in the food that you're making? Right. And so we came in thinking we're doing this service, we're trying to help. And we didn't, make the impact that we necessarily could have because we didn't ask, because we didn't do our research. We didn't try and figure out exactly what was needed. So totally, I mean, to your point, it is really important to ask the people that you want to help how you can help. I think right now, for me personally, I've been having a lot of people reach out to me, ask me how I'm doing, right, and offering their support in different ways. And I had one friend in particular who Venmoed me some money,
Mm.
but just unsolicited, right, making this assumption that this is the way that I want it to be supported, right. And
Right.
so for me, I was totally offended by that, right.
Mm.
I don't need your money, right? If you want to put your money towards something, put it in a direction that's going to help with changing some of the systematic racism that we have. And so like ask, try and figure out, how can I be supportive, and sort of leave it at that. Ask and listen.
Yeah, and I'm coming back to something I wrote down here. You said the solutions are going to be very variable, and I just think community to community, how is that going to be different, right? So instead of taking this more national type of approach, being like, oh, I know it's good for everybody, really coming back to your local community and seeing how you can make change there. And I always come back to this idea that I think was put forward by Buckminster Fuller. It was paraphrased by a teacher, so I'm he said that's where he got it from, but he said, our goal here is to make small local adjustments in the universe. And so, how could you make small local adjustments in the community?
Yeah, it's really important. And also, not only are the interventions going to be different from community to community, but like your role in those interventions are going
Hmm.
to change over time as well. So for me, I spent so much of my time really doing a lot of the psychedelic advocacy. And so right now, I'm sort of having the shift towards trying to support mental health treatment
Mm.
in communities of color. And so that happened directly because of my role in the psychedelic community. I was a part of the MAPS MDMA therapy training for people of color. And, I left that training trying to figure out how can we bring this therapy to communities that need it. Um, and the answer that kept coming up over and over again was like, well, first we have to figure out how we can bring mental health in general to these
Yeah.
communities before we're then asking, how we can bring something that's ultra stigmatized, right? How can we bring something that's already stigmatized first? And so, for me, looking at where I can be effective, where I can be the most effective, of course, it's not that I won't be doing what I can for all layers of it, but I also have to be doing, what I can just in the general conversation around mental health in those communities. And so people's roles are going to change, right? And you have
Mm.
to allow those things to change. And, as I said, change is the only constant in life, right? So just sort of rolling through and figuring out, okay, what are the needs, constantly doing that assessment, constantly asking, constantly listening, and following the answers.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Do you have any? Well, I guess maybe Joe already asked you this about resources. Anything that you like to point people towards for just, helping themselves to learn, maybe and unlearn whatever's kind of going on for them?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it depends on exactly that you sort of want to learn, right? So if you want to learn more about systematic racism, I mean, I think there's a lot of great information out there. You just have to sort of search. There's a list of, sort of local representatives in Minnesota that was put together for people who want to sort of show their support for some conviction for the police officers. And I mean, I think looking at that would be a sort of a great way to take action right now. And that's something that, I can send over some resources to you.
That'd be
Maybe
awesome.
you can post on the website with this recording.
Yeah.
So, just figuring out how you can be a good ally, just first knowing that you have to sort of acknowledge what your privilege is, and then do some reading, right? And so make use of the Google machine, right? The information is out there. You really just have to be willing to search it and look for it, and just kind of figure out the way that you can be sort of effective and the way that you can learn the things that you need to learn.
So this idea of analyzing your privilege, I think sometimes this is also it's very hard for people to do. And so I'm wondering what type of questions, maybe you've asked yourself, like you said, you've been asking yourself questions and, being in a place of going to graduate school and becoming a nurse practitioner and having some sort of privilege. Like, how are you analyzing that? Maybe like, what are some questions you're asking yourself? Because like, I'm guessing maybe there are some people that don't think that they are in a privileged position or, aren't really taking the time to analyze it, or maybe don't even know what questions to even start asking themselves.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I think it's really going to be an individual experience for people, right? So for me, the questions started coming when I went to Ghana. So I went on a medical mission to Ghana, and that's the country where I was born. And it was my first time going back. This was just a year ago. And just seeing, what the lifestyle was like over there, and knowing that, my parents worked hard enough to get me over to the States.
Mm.
And so for me, that really shifted a lot, knowing that there's privilege of so many different layers. So I had the privilege to first come to America, and then of course having the privilege to be educated and sort of get into the work that I'm doing right now. So when I'm asking myself, like, how can I be effective? I'm looking at it from different perspectives. First off, it's, how can I support my home country, right? And so I've gotten involved with a nonprofit that is supporting a school. It's called Hosi Kids. It's supporting a school out in Accra, which is the capital city of Ghana. And so the intention of this organization is to expand classrooms to support the education of those students. And so, part of the answer for me was, doing what I can to support education in Ghana, right? And so now for me, because of my background and my education, I'm trying to figure out how I can be effective in bridging sort of the gaps in mental health treatment and in these communities of color, right? And so for me, that's speaking with counselors about, how you can approach treating people of color, but also bringing those conversations to students, right? Bringing those conversations to people in my personal life, looking at it from like a multi-layered perspective. And so like you have to have that intention too to start asking those questions. You have to like want to do it. If you don't want to do it, of course, it's just not going to happen. You're not going to figure out, how you can use whatever privilege you have to support the causes that you're saying that you support. And so like it's really going to be individualized. It's going to look different for everybody. And, the way that you can be effective doesn't have to be in a large, grand way, right? Maybe the way that you can be effective is simply by having those conversations with your family, right? Maybe the way that you can be effective is by doing some reading, right? And learning about the history of the United States and learning about your role in it, right? Learning about what privilege looks like, right? How privilege presents. And so, there are just so many different sort of perspectives that you can have around that.
Yeah, and so many different types of privilege, like even you just saying like your parents coming over, did you say from Ghana? And, that's going to look like, so that's like a different type of privilege, right? Than somebody that's born here and maybe is born into privilege versus, so yeah, I think it is going to be very individual. And there's all these I guess, different layers of privilege, and what does that look like? So,
Yeah,
yeah, thank you for that.
absolutely.
So I know that we're about to hit an hour here, Kwasi. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you want to close with, any final thoughts here. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I know we asked you pretty much last minute to do this. So I'm just really grateful for your time and showing up here and just having a conversation with us. So, we can get it out there to folks in the psychedelic world.
Yeah, I mean, I want to thank you again for just allowing the space for the conversation. I'm a student of all of this stuff just as much as anybody else is,
Hmm.
and also living it in different ways
Yeah.
too, right? And experiencing a multitude of emotions and feelings and thoughts like everybody else is, right? I think everybody's anxieties are just a little bit more heightened right now for
Hmm.
lots of good reason. And for me, I'm a sublimator, right? So for me, it helps to put my anxiety towards something. And part of that is like trying to figure out what I can do, right, to support the sort of movement
Hmm.
that's going to dismantle a lot of the systematic racism that we have, right? And so the thing that I want to hammer home, and it's something I've been hammering home this entire podcast, is like figure out what you can do, right? Figure out something that if you are somebody who is saying that you support this movement, if you're somebody who says that you are an ally, right? Like don't just stop there, but figure out in what way you can actually sort of use some of the privilege that you have. If it's having conversations with your friends, or if it's doing something that's more policy related, if it's working to defund police so that the money can be used to support education, right? If it's sharing resources, whatever it is, just figure out what it is for you, and be serious about it. And I think that the world is just a better place when people sort of live in accordance to their values.
Hmm.
And everything that we can do to make our little world, our little piece of the world, a little bit better is going to make it better for everybody else. So I
Totally.
appreciate you for allowing me here today to share that
Yeah,
message.
yeah, and thank you for just helping us learn along the way. I mean, there's so much that we're trying to learn as well, and so thanks for taking the time to help us process this. And I would just want to close on, when you're talking about doing little things. I remember when we met, it was at Horizons. I forget how long ago this was, 3 years ago, and you were saying that you were from, you had a psychedelic society, and you were going to do a psychedelic cleanup. And my immediate thought was, man, this is a psychedelic club that's just not meeting to talk about their experiences. They're actually going out in the world and trying to do something. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And so I just wanted to highlight that. Like when I actually first met you, it was like clicking, like, this guy's going to do something really awesome in the world.
I really
You know?
appreciate that. I really, really appreciate that. I think that people aren't their thoughts, they're what they do.
Hmm.
And so looking at what action looks like for you is the way that you can really change the world, start that
Hmm.
catalyst process. I think we're all change makers, right? And we can all do a lot of good things in this world. So I appreciate you for bringing that up, because for us, like being a psychedelic organization doing community service was really important because we care about the planet,
Hmm. Yeah.
and so I think that really speaks to the fact that it doesn't matter what your primary thing is that you support, right? Like everything that we're all doing, they're all connected, right? We're
Totally.
all trying to make the world a little bit better. So
Yeah. Awesome, Kwasi. Well, thank you so much. And I don't know if you have an online presence or you want to plug yourself anywhere at the end here.
yeah, I mean, I what I'd really love is, if there are people out there who want to be part of the conversation about how we can bring mental health into communities of color, people who are interested in psychedelic therapies, I'd love if you emailed me, right? If you can have some conversation, if you're a person of color yourself, or you're somebody who is working in the realm of counseling, and this is something that's meaningful for you, like I'd love for you to email me. So I can share with you my email that you can post on the podcast, kwasiadu@buffalo.edu. I really just want to talk with people. I want to connect with people. And I want to see how sort of collectively and together we can sort of chip away at this big problem that we have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kwasi. Until next time.
Thank you.